Okay, hi everyone, we're now going to move on to Act 3, and you'll know from the end of Act 2 that Duncan has been killed, his sons Malcolm and Donalbain have fled both to England and Ireland, and Macbeth has been crowned king because basically he's kind of next in line. So at the opening to Act 3 we encounter Banquo. Now, Banquo, remember, is the only person who heard the witch's prophecies aside from Macbeth, so he knows that these prophecies have now came true to some extent, and he suspects Macbeth having committed some sort of foul play. The problem is that Macbeth also knows that Banquo knows this, and Macbeth's paranoia begins to filter in around the start of Act 3, and he fears the prophecy that Banquo heard might come true, that Banquo's sons will become kings. So he begins to see Banquo, even though Banquo was one of his best friends and comrades and allies, he begins to see this man as a threat. So the paranoia that's filtering in fuels a decision that he makes, and he convinces two murderers to go and kill Banquo and Fleance, who's Banquo's son. Now, when he convinces them to do this, he doesn't let Lady Macbeth know any of his plans, and the next time he speaks to her, he doesn't mention this, but basically says he has plans for Banquo and doesn't reveal what he said. This kind of indicates to the audience that the monster that Lady Macbeth has created in Macbeth is now out of her control. She can no longer control the actions that he does, and although she wanted to manipulate and persuade him, he's now went beyond her control. We then move to a scene where we have a banquet that's taken place, and it's a large gathering of all the lords and the kind of ladies and the thanes, and they're gathering for a banquet that's being held by the king, by Macbeth. And at the opening of the banquet, we eventually have these murderers who return from having tried to kill Banquo and Fleance, but only having killed Banquo. So Banquo dies, having been murdered by these hitmen essentially, and they return to the castle, tell Macbeth that Banquo is dead, but Fleance has escaped. Now this fuels more paranoia, and in fact during the banquet, Macbeth has a hallucination, and he sees the corpse, the kind of dead body with the blood and the gore of Banquo. At the beginning, he sees him sitting in his own chair, in Macbeth's chair, and he starts to kind of frantically remark and talk to this corpse as if everyone else can see it. And he has this mental deterioration in front of all of these noblemen and noblewomen at this banquet. It then continues where Lady Macbeth tries to calm him down, and Lady Macbeth basically kind of makes excuses for him and says, you know, he's been under a lot of pressure, and the banquet finishes with Lady Macbeth essentially sending Macbeth away to his own room, and the scene ends. Now, it finishes the whole act. It finishes with Lennox remarking how Macduff has fled to England, and that Macduff is trying to get support to overthrow Macbeth, because Macduff sees Macbeth as a tyrant and he sees him as not being the rightful king. So Lennox kind of remarks this. It also ends with another character who's kind of new and doesn't really make much else in terms of any other input, is Hecate. And Hecate is the goddess of witches, and Hecate basically says to the three witches that she's angry that she wasn't informed about this plan that they have with Macbeth. And the witches kind of calm Hecate down and say, we're going to speak to Macbeth again about his destiny and lead him on a path of confusion. So the audience already knows by the end of this act, by the end of Act 3, that basically Macbeth's destiny has been decided by the witches, because they know he will listen to them, and they're going to lead him down another confusing path. In terms of this particular act, I'm going to narrow it down to another two key quotes in my opinion. The first happens in scene 2, and it's when Lady Macbeth is trying her best to kind of support Macbeth, because he's talking to her about his deteriorated mental state and he's suffering mentally. And she says to him, she says these kind of niceties to him to support him, and he says, "Full of scorpions is my mind." And he's basically saying to her that he feels like his mind is poisoned, because obviously, as we know, a scorpion could have a tail that can sting, and that sting could be poisonous. So the image of these scorpions in his mind is one that suggests he knows that he has some sort of self-awareness that he's deteriorating mentally. The second key quote that I would pick comes from scene 4 in this act, and it's Macbeth kind of shouting almost, and during this banquet, to this vision of Banquo. He says, never shake thy gory locks at me. And he's frantically trying to control this situation, and he's trying to tell Banquo to back off and back down, even though, of course, it's a hallucination, it's a vision, it's a ghost. And it's an important quote because it highlights that Macbeth is so used to being in control and in command. He's a warrior, he's fought many battles and won many battles, but he can't fight against the supernatural. He can't fight against something that isn't physically there. And he's trying his best to have this kind of argument with a figment of his imagination. Now, those are the two key quotes I would say, in my opinion, for that particular act. As I say, there's many others, but I think those are the best. Hopefully this has helped for Act 3. We're going to move on to Act 4 next as well.